Let's talk about some of the causes of bloating and some of the things that you need to be able to differentiate between to understand if it's water retention bloating, if it's stomach bloating, or if it's actual fat tissue that's accumulating. So we're going to break it down. So the first thing we need to really understand here is that there's really two kinds of bloating, okay, and they can kind of bleed over, right? We have the stomach bloating, like the typical gas, kind of hardened stomach bloating, very stereotypical bloating, and then we have the inflammatory response bloating, which is more of the water retention type of bloating that we might see in the midsection, we might see it throughout our body, might see it in our limbs. We definitely will see it in the midsection, and it can be deceiving because it can still be watery and kind of make you feel like you're gaining fat, when in reality it's a water retention kind of thing. Now, that same inflammatory bloating can result in inflammation in the face, but that has a lot of different variables, so we're not going to focus too much on facial bloating here. So let's understand, what's the difference between bloat and fat? Okay, it sounds very basic, but it's important to understand. First off, bloating is generally localized in the abdomen. Okay, if you're gaining fat, sure, you might see it in the abdomen, but you're probably going to see it in places like the hips and thighs as well. So that seems obvious, but it's still very important to mention with this video. Bloating is usually hard and tight. Okay, so you're going to notice that it's not something that you can just like push in. It's very like hard and tight and feels much more like that, versus fat being obviously much more spongy. Again, kind of an obvious thing. Okay, another thing is going to be the changes throughout the course of the day. Okay, if you wake up in the morning and your stomach is nice and flat and firm, and then throughout the day it feels more bloated, well, that is a very clear indicator that it's bloating. Another thing that you can do is step on the scale in the morning, step on the scale in the evening, and if you have a pretty big delta between those two numbers, like if you're gaining 7, 8, 9, 10 pounds throughout the course of the day, you know you're not gaining fat, you know you didn't eat 10 pounds of food, maybe you have a lot of water and gas and everything like that, that is contributing to that. So if you look drastically different, I'm not saying that you should calm down and relax over it. Obviously there's something that needs to be addressed, but there's a good indicator that that could just be much more related to, well, bloating versus fat accumulation. And lastly, if it's uncomfortable, it's usually bloating related. I mean, sure, it's uncomfortable to be overweight, I've been there before, but it's a different kind of discomfort. See, bloating is putting pressure on these nerves, and that net pressure on the nerves is sending a signal to the brain for discomfort. Okay, so bloating is uncomfortable, whereas you could be blissfully unaware that you have body fat on you because it's not really pushing on the nerves so much. So the literal discomfort from the nerves themselves is much less. Let's talk about water retention, because this is a big one. Okay, maybe you're not bloated just in the abdomen, but you're bloated from just water retention. Now I'm going to put facial bloating aside for a second, because facial bloating can happen as a result of allergies, can happen as a result of stress, and there's lots of different cascades that happen there. Okay, I've done videos where like my face has dark circles under it and it's bloated because I was having a ragweed attack, right? Allergies are a whole different ball game. But here's 3 quick reasons why you might be holding water and things that you can address, and then we'll move into the stomach bloating and some of the other more hormonal pieces too. First off, you have too much insulin floating around, meaning for you, you're consuming too much in the way of carbohydrates. I'm not saying everyone needs to go low carb. I'm not suggesting that per se. I would say that if you do follow a lower carb protocol, your insulin levels are generally going to be lower, so it could be a way to mitigate some of this water retention you're dealing with. But the more insulin that you have as a result of carbohydrates, the more that your kidneys hold on to water. Insulin programs the kidneys to retain water. So if insulin is chronically high, the kidneys are chronically telling the body to retain water. Drop your insulin levels, what do you know? You start losing water. That's why when people go on like a keto diet and things like that, they lose so much water weight so fast. People bag on that like it's a bad thing, but clearly you're losing water that you probably should be losing. The next one is too much or too little sodium. Okay, too much sodium is obvious. It's going to draw more water in to try to dilute all the sodium, because your body tries to keep a nice balance in the plasma. Okay, needs to be a nice gradient. Now, too little sodium can trigger an issue too. Okay, because too little sodium, the body will actually try to hold on to water in terms of reducing urination to try to preserve minerals, because if there's not enough sodium, then sending the signal, oh, well, we got to make sure that we retain what we have in the way of minerals. So it's important to find that balance. More often than not, people have an acute swelling that comes as a result of having too much salt, but if they were to go ahead and increase their salt, generally speaking, in a healthy way, they might find things balance out, believe it or not. The next one is not moving your body enough throughout the course of the day, and I don't mean going and doing a crazy hard workout or anything like that. I mean just moving your body, move your limbs, move your lower limbs, move your upper limbs, because we forget forget that our circulatory system does a lot of work, but it also relies on the compression and the constriction of our muscles, putting restriction on those vessels, right? And squeezing fluid back up, squeezing blood, squeezing lymph. So getting the body moving, that acts like an artificial pump to move fluid throughout the body and not pool in one given spot. Now, specifically stomach bloating, this is something that people deal with all the time, okay? The number one cause is actually quite simple. It's usually a lack of hydrochloric acid, and that's plain and simple. Okay, a lack of stomach acid is gonna slow down digestion, it's gonna trigger this bloating response after we eat, and it can last for hours and hours and hours. And one of the main causes of hydrochloric acid reduction is simply age. As we get older, we are not designed to be able to digest as much food. So what can you do? Well, there's little things you can do. You can add more water to your diet, which seems like it would dilute hydrochloric acid, but a lot of times that actually can help with digestion. Adding apple cider vinegar is a very good thing in terms of digestion. I wouldn't necessarily recommend taking a bunch of enzymes and things like that. I would just recommend doing what you can to increase fiber content at first. I'm going to get to SIBO in a second, so if you have that, that's a different story, so that your body can actually start to upregulate those bacteria a little bit more and kind of get more of that going on. But one of the big ones that we forget about, zinc deficiencies and vitamin B deficiencies play a role in hydrochloric acid. If we're deficient in zinc and some B vitamins, but mainly zinc, we become deficient or have less hydrochloric acid. When we have less hydrochloric acid, we start extracting less minerals from our food. So it's a vicious cycle. So once you become deficient in zinc, then you have lower HCl, then you're not extracting more zinc, and then it becomes vicious. So try to eat more shellfish, eat things like nuts that have zinc in them, like pumpkin seeds are great, but go ahead and use a zinc supplement if you absolutely need to, but fish and shellfish are probably one of the best bioavailable forms of zinc that you could eat. Another one is H. pylori. Okay, Johns Hopkins University took a look at H. pylori, and they demonstrated that what happens when H. pylori, you have an overgrowth of this particular bacteria, it creates this particular enzyme, or an overgrowth of this enzyme called urease. And this urease will actually neutralize hydrochloric acid. So even if you're producing enough hydrochloric acid, it can get neutralized by this urease. So this is a big issue because it, of course, triggers this bloating. Best way to combat the H. pylori, of course, is generally with antibiotics under medical supervision, but by actually just increasing the right kinds of fibers and adding a diverse amount of foods to your diet, also limiting carbohydrate consumption for a little bit so you have less to feed on, then that might help you as well. Probiotics could have a role if you are someone that is in gut dysbiosis. I'm not saying that probiotics fix everything, but a lot of times they are a good start for people that are dealing with bloating, because bloating can be kind of an indicator of a bigger issue going on in terms of dysbiosis. The one that I use, I put a link down below if you want to save 15% off of it, is called Seed. You've probably seen them floating around the internet before, but Seed is really cool. Not only do they do a bunch of their own microbiome research, and they probably are the biggest forerunners when it comes down to like companies investing in microbiome research. It's really cool, but they have a cool technology. So if you look at the footage right now, I'm showing it's got a capsule inside of a capsule. This is like unreal stuff, like really cool tech. So when you take this probiotic, it's a synbiotic. So it has a prebiotic and a probiotic, and they've kind of have a multi-stage delivery where part of it digests in your gut, and then the rest of it kind of goes down into different areas of your small and large intestine. This is really cool stuff because it means that they are working hard towards making sure that it's getting to the right place, okay? So that link down below will save you 15% off of Seed's Daily Synbiotic. Absolutely has Thomas's stamp of approval on it. I've been talking about them for about a year and a half now. I've really been a big fan of them and using them regularly. So that link's down below. Save 15% off using that code and using that link. So check them out. Okay, hormones. This is a big one, and I'm not just going to give you information, I'm going to hopefully give you some stuff that can help correct it too. Now at first this is going to sound like it's only geared towards women, but it's also geared towards men in some ways too. It's still important to pay attention to this. Now the hormonal flux with perimenopause, the transitional stage prior to menopause for women, can really trigger a lot of bloating, even more so than menopause itself. Because with perimenopause, you have this hormonal flux where everything is shifting all the time and the body is trying to find homeostasis. When the body is struggling to find homeostasis, that's when swelling and water retention can occur. So very important that we deal with that properly. But namely with perimenopause, you start to see higher estrogen and lower progesterone, okay? Now, along with that, estrogen is very solid when it comes to water retention, very known for that. The more estrogen you have without the progesterone, progesterone is a natural diuretic, so it's a double whammy. You have estrogen being high, which helps you retain water, progesterone, which is normally a diuretic and helps you lose water, that being low, do the math, right? It can turn into a terrible cycle. Plus your body's trying to find balance, that doesn't help. The other side of the coin is for people that aren't perimenopausal, people that are even younger women. If their progesterone levels are too high, then that can cause an issue too. That's why, think about it, like prior to a period, 1 or 2 weeks before the period, there's a lot of bloating that occurs. Well, what's going on there? Well, there's a study that was published in the World Journal of Gastroenterology that kind of explains it mechanistically a little bit, but I'll talk about that in a second. Essentially, progesterone can calm the gut. So in a small amount, that's actually good, a calm, relaxed gut that's able to deal with things. But when progesterone is too high, it calms the gut too much and digestive processes slow down. When these digestive processes slow down, guess what? Bloating occurs because it's not rapid. Motility has slowed. Okay, now this World Journal of Gastroenterology took a look at male rats. Okay, it's a rodent model, so we take that for what it's worth, but it's still very interesting and might inspire you to kind of learn more. Okay, so what happened is these male rats, they gave them a low dose of progesterone, and low dose of progesterone made it so that they actually improved gut motility. Things moved through nice and fast. When they gave them a high dose of progesterone, it slowed things down dramatically. So the dose matters. So where you are in terms of progesterone cycle can play a big role. So what do you do? What are some tips for that? First tip, extra water. That's probably the easiest thing, right? Helps flush things out. Do that. A little extra water will never hurt unless you're going too far. The next one sounds kind of simple, but is reduce your adipose tissue as much as you can. Okay, adipose tissue is a reservoir for estrogen. Okay, so the more fat tissue that we have, the more estrogen that we hold on to, the more water retention that we have. Okay, so reducing fat, which kind of goes coinciding with this next one, we need to control insulin resistance. Okay, I'm not saying everyone needs to go keto, but I do think that if you cut carbs down or temporarily reduce them to reduce your insulin levels, you will allow your body an opportunity to tap into those fat stores a little bit better, potentially making it so that there you have less of a reservoir for that estrogen. But there's another piece to that. Insulin resistance is strongly correlated with follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone issues, meaning that the communication between the brain and the actual ovaries and all this system that is causing us to retain water and gain weight is all interlinked. So giving your body a break from insulin by going low carb might be just the catalyst that you need to kickstart the stopping of bloating. Again, I'm not saying it's a fix-all. That's not my role here. It's not a magic pill, but insulin does play a pretty strong role with how we retain water as it pertains to estrogen and luteinizing hormone, all this kind of cohort of things that go together. And of course, the other one is adding salt into the equation. If you add salt, a lot of times, I don't want to say it fixes things, but if you have these big fluctuations of water retention, sometimes having the right signaling with sodium can help. The last thing I want to talk about, which is one that's still very important, is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. I don't want you to rule this one out because it's becoming more and more popular. Small intestinal bacterial overgrowth is where you have too much of the bacteria in your upper intestine, your small intestine, that overgrows. Most of the bacteria should be in the gut, not in the small intestine, in the upper GI. What happens is when this occurs, you have a bunch of gas. Well, SIBO is defined specifically by the number of bacteria, but what's more important when you start looking at the data, especially a study that was published in the International Journal of Inflammation, they kind of concluded that it's not just the number of bacteria, it's the kind of bacteria. So bacteria that would produce more in the way of hydrogen, more in the way of methane, more in the way of carbon dioxide, that contributes to it more. So again, it's about getting a diversity of foods that might make it more difficult at first, but over time it will help. So try going low FODMAP for a little while to see if that helps. You can look up FODMAP. The other thing we have to remember is that SIBO interferes with carbohydrate breakdown. What that means is that when you're consuming a bunch of carbohydrates, the SIBO is affecting the enzymes that break down the carbs. So that means that you're not digesting carbohydrates as well, which is kind of a good thing for your blood glucose, but not exactly the best thing for the gut. That means the more carbohydrates you have, the more you're being affected by it because SIBO is making it so that you don't have the ability to deal with those carbohydrates as well. So temporarily giving yourself a break from the carbohydrates to potentially stave off that bacteria a little bit and stop that process and allow the SIBO to be dealt with might reduce some of that bloating. Then as the SIBO goes down, then maybe the carbohydrates are fine for you. I'm not anti-carb. I just think that they need to be put in a specific place, especially if you're dealing with bloating issues. And as a quick PS on this entire video, don't forget about stress too. Stress and how you breathe breathe with stress and the hyperventilating and swallowing too much oxygen when you don't even realize it, just generally throughout the day, definitely plays a role too. If you're taking nice, good diaphragmatic breaths through where you should be, into the lower lobes of the lungs, not swallowing air like that, you're gonna have less of that bloating that occurs as well. So I hope that this gave you some insight as to how bloating occurs within our body and maybe gave you a, I don't know, framework to start correcting it. As always, I'll see you tomorrow.